Hello, today we're going to have a look at doing a watercolour from a photograph, and I wanted to talk to you mainly about changing the photograph and picking out what you like best about it. A lot of beginners tend to just copy the whole photograph. We're not photographers, we're not taking photographs, we're making our own artwork, so really you need to use a bit of artistic license, move things around, change things to make a picture. You're making a picture, you're creating a picture, you're not taking a photograph, but you like to use photographs for reference. So this is one I took on holiday, and I've got some paper here ready, and this is the one I'm using. I thought I would show you because a lot of people like to know which paper I use. So this is an SAA practice paper, which is one I use a lot for practice work because it's quite an inexpensive one, but it's also very good for when you're practicing. So it's £140, and the SAA stands for the Society of All Artists, but you can get it online through Amazon as well as through the SAA's own website. So I'll pop the link below to that paper so that you know which one I'm using, and I've taped that one down there. So again, this photograph was one I took on holiday, and the reason for choosing it was because of this lady's hat. So I want to make the hat the main focus, and the fact that it's a windy day and her hair's flying up, so that was really the focus. So what I'm going to do with this is some things I'm going to take out. So I'm not going to put these boats in. I'm going to make it, you can see here she's got a phone up, she's taking a photograph, and I'm going to make it as if she's taking a photograph of this headland here. So basically I'm making the background very simple so that the focus is going to be on her hat. So I'll show you what I've done so far. You might not be able to see the pencil marks that well showing up on the camera, I'm not sure. So I've left these lines of the rails out, I've left these boats out. I've got the headland here slightly bigger than it is on the actual photograph, and then she's slightly lower down and without any of this distraction of this other person here. So her arm it's sort of chopped off by about there somewhere. So simplifying it quite a lot. So to begin with, can you see all this spray and light that we've got in the sea? Now with watercolours, we work from light to dark, and we use the white of the paper as our lightest areas. Now you can preserve the white of the paper either by painting around it, but of course that's quite tiresome, or you can preserve the white of the paper with masking fluid. I've done a video previously using masking fluid, and I'll put the link to that one here. Or you can use a wax crayon. So this is an oil wax, but you can just use an ordinary Crayola wax crayon as long as it's a white one. And if you haven't got a wax crayon, you could also use a candle, because basically it's just for forming a resist. But the only thing with using this as a beginner is try practicing with it first, because once you've put it on, it's there, and then you won't be able to paint over that area. So you've got to be quite confident with it. The other thing is, you could just do the whole painting, and then if there were areas that you felt needed to be lighter and you wanted to get that white back, you could use an acrylic paint as a little bit of a cheat over the top. Okay, so what I'm going to do to begin with is look at the paint picture and decide where I want my lightest areas to be. So I'm going to put a little bit of shine on the sea in patches down here, and of course water lies flat, so keep your lines going horizontally. And then there's a lot more spray here where it's nearer to the front of the boat, so I'm just going to dab it there, so that's going to be quite light. And I'm actually going to alter the shadows and things on the hat. If you see, she's obviously in the shade from maybe the main part of the boat, but I'm going to make this hat a lot sunnier. So maybe her shirt will still be in shade from her hat itself, but I'm going to imagine that the sun's more up here and this area of the hat's going to be sunnier. So I'm going to actually put a little bit of a highlight on the top of her hat, and maybe a tiny little shine on the phone, because the phone's going to be metal, so it's going to have a bit of a shine on, so just a little tiny shine there, and a little shine on the top of the boat. And then just on these rocks, and maybe a little glint on this lighthouse. But that's enough. Like I say, we can always try and get some of that white back if we feel we've not got enough later on, but don't overdo it with your wax crayon. So to begin with, I'm going to do the sky. Now this line here I did put in with a ruler. There's nothing wrong with using a ruler now and again if you want to, because horizons are level on the sea. Water lies flat. You're not going to get a wonky horizon, and if you've not got it level, when somebody comes to look at your painting, it's going to immediately jump out at them as being wrong. So get that line straight. So to begin with, I'm going to do the sky. So first of all, I'll wet that. And I think when you're beginning, it's a good idea just to let things dry in between. So just do the sky first, let that dry, and then carry on down. So a nice big flat brush to get that area wet, but also to be able to go around that lighthouse there. And make a nice straight edge along the water. So that's nicely damp. And then I'm going to get a mix of some cerulean blue. And I'm just going to add to that a touch of the Cobolt blue, but only a small amount. So it's mostly cerulean with a tiny touch of Cobolt and plenty of water, because it's a light sky because it's a very bright day. And just go all the way across. Reload your brush with paint all the way across again, down those hills. It's drying out quite quickly, the paper, because it's a nice warm day today. So this is something as a beginner with watercolours you've got to think about adjusting, is the amount of water you're putting on for the day that you're dealing with, because in winter things can dry very slowly and stay wet for a long time, and in summer they can dry very quickly, and with your central heating, etc. So just be aware that your paints may not dry at the same rate as mine, depending on how warm it is in your room. Okay, so just at the edge there, where it meets the sea, I've just got a damp brush now, no water on this brush, just a damp brush, and just to soften that line off there. Now you can't see from there, but I've actually tilted this board, so I've got a prop underneath it at this side, so the board is slightly tilted this way. I would usually work on an easel, but it's easier when I'm videoing to do it on a board flat, but when I'm doing a watercolour I like to tilt it slightly. So now I'm going to leave that to dry. Okay, so now that's completely dry, we can go on to the next part. Now if you want to test whether something's dry or not, never touch your painting with your hand like that. We have oil on our fingertips, in our skin, and that can damage your painting. Always very gently use the back of your hand, and if it still feels cool, then it's probably still damp. Also, put your head to one side and look across the surface of the paper to see if it looks shiny. The other thing to note now is this is a lot lighter than when we first put it on. So again, as beginners, that's something we need to have in the back of our mind, is that when we are painting with our watercolours, we need to put the colours on slightly stronger than the painting is going to end up. So usually dry about 50% lighter. So now we're going to move on to these rocks, and they're very light in colour because they've got a lot of sun on them. So I've got, and they're quite a reddy stone. So I'm mixing some yellow ochre with a tiny bit of burnt sienna in to give us that reddy colour, but I'm using quite a lot of water to let the paper come through because it's quite a light stone. And just fill in the whole thing in to begin with, and then I'll come back and put some more shadows on top as that starts to dry, and some more detail. So there, can you, perhaps I don't know if you can see yet, but where I put the wax, the paint isn't sticking to that wax. And on the photograph itself, like I say, I'll put a link below in the description to the photograph. We can see very little detail on this lighthouse because it's so far in the distance, so just get an impression of it with getting some lines, both vertical and horizontal, on there. Okay, so I'm going to leave that to dry, and then I'm going to come back and put some more shadows and things in those rocks. So I'm going to move on now to the sea. So again, I'm going to get my nice big flat brush and wet that sea area. But it wants to be wet, but not actually flooding, you know. Don't want any pools of water. Go around her hand there. Hands are quite difficult to draw, but this one isn't too bad because she's sort of got it in that shape with each finger curled over. And if you're new to drawing, just sometime when you've got 5 minutes, try drawing your own hand. It's very good practice. Just some quick sketches. So just again, if you tilt your head, look across the paper, just make sure there's no puddles and that it's all evenly covered. And because we've left her dry, you shouldn't have to worry too much about the paint going onto her. So for the sea, I'm using the same mix, but I'm going to add to it some more Cobolt. So this time we've got the same two blues, the Cobolt and the Cerulean, but we've got a lot more Cobolt than we have Cerulean, and also a lot less water because the sea is a much stronger blue than the sky. And use nice horizontal lines, because obviously again water goes this way, it doesn't go that way. And if you just leave a little gap at the top, can you see how I've left tiny bits of white between the rocks and the sea? Just a tiny bit. You usually find there's that little bit of light by the horizon there. Again, that needs to be nice and straight. So although we're drawing around her, we could still do with, you know, having these lines horizontal if we can, but you need to get that shape of the hand in, so you need to have a nice brush that's got a good tip. So you can see as I'm going like this, I'm getting plenty of paint down with this brush, but when I hold it up and use the tip, I've got that nice fine shape, which is why you need good brushes. So when you're buying a brush, look and see if it comes into a nice tip point at the end. And when it's warm weather like this and it's drying out quickly, like I said before, just soften that edge off there whilst you're working over here so that that's not drying out and leaving a hard edge. And of course you can go over the margin, because if once it's in its frame or its mount, nobody's going to see this down here. We'll do a bit of negative painting now, so some of her hair strands are going to be there, but we can still see some of the see-through, so we'll just imagine those. Now as we come down this side, we should be able to see more where the wax is not letting us go over that paper. And again, make sure that wrist and that hand, that we've got a nice shape around them. So there you go, you can see that the wax is stopping us with the paint, so getting that nice glint of light into the sea. So using quite a small brush just so that I can get that detail. Trying to see what number it is. It'll be about a number 6, I should think. Nice round synthetic one. Okay, while that's still wet, I'm just going to add a little bit of extra paint, some more of the Cobolt, so it's a bit thicker, and just look where it might be darker in one or two places. Sorry, I've just banged the camera. Where you know, the waves cast shadows, their own shadows. You know, when there's a wave, it casts its own little shadow. So there's going to be some shadows under these rocks. There's going to be a bit of variety in the depth of colour in the water there. You could use a lot more colours. You could, you know, as you become more advanced, you look at see all these different colours in the water. But for this little exercise, because I want the focus to be on the girl and on her hat, I'm not going to worry too much about having a very detailed background. I want the background to be quite, what's the word? I want the background to be quite simple. But always keep these lines going across like that. Okay, and don't forget that that's going to dry lighter. And whilst I've been doing the sea, obviously this little bit has been drying. I've done what I said you shouldn't do and put my finger on, haven't I? So I'm going to go back to the same colour. Again, make it a little bit thicker with a bit more pigment and less water. And I'm just going to look at some of those shadows in the rocks there. And just some sort of, don't get bogged down in making sure it's like just like the photograph. Like I said, you're making a picture. You're not copying slavishly this photo. Just get an impression of some of the rock shapes and where the shadows might be. And again, we're going to leave that to dry, and then I'm going to come back and do one or two more shadows in it when that's dry. So we can now move on to something like her hat. Like I said, I'm going to imagine that it's in... Excuse me, I don't know if you can hear that. That's one of my donkeys shouting outside the window. She's a bit noisy. So she interrupted me. I'm going to imagine that this hat is much more in the sun than it is in the photograph. If you look in the photograph, it's in the shade. So I want to make it a lot brighter. So I want to do it yellow. So I'll wet the hat to begin with, but I won't wet the band. Now if you're worried about the blue of the sea going into a hat, which it could easily do now if you touch it, then leave your sea to dry before you go on to doing the hat. If you're quite cautious and you go just nicely up to the edge, you should be okay, but it's drying quite quickly anyway. Again, you don't want big puddles of water, you just want to make this area nicely damp. And I want it a nice bright yellow. So I know it's quite a dull straw on the picture, but I want it a nice bright yellow, so I'm going to go for a cadmium. Nice and sunny. And again, it won't stick where we've put that wax earlier. Like I say, you might want to use masking fluid, or you might just want to... The other thing I didn't mention was lifting out. So whilst it's still wet, you can get a damp brush and lift it out, providing you've got a good quality paint and a good quality paper. If you have a cheap paper, you may not be able to lift out just the same. So I'll list the colours below in the description. So the watercolours I use, I always use Winsor & Newton artist quality watercolours. because you'll have similar colours in your palette. If you, whether you're using a different make, you'll no doubt have a nice bright yellow in there somewhere, cadmium or something similar. Okay, now we'll leave that to dry before we attempt to do the band or any extra detail on that. So we'll go down, perhaps we'll go across actually now to a skin. So we'll need a smaller brush for this. So the only bit of skin we can see, actually you can see some of her skin under here. She's got this shirt is sort of billowing in the wind, and then she's got a bikini or something underneath. So there's some of her chest showing here, and obviously her arm there. So the colours I'm going to use for that, again I'm going to get some of the yellow ochre, plenty of water, and a tiny touch of cadmium orange. So you could use any red really, just give them a bit of a practice, your different reds and yellows to make some skin tones. I've not wet her hand this time because it's quite a small area to cover, and I'm going to do it quite quickly. Again, her hat might just run into her hand a bit there, but it's not going to matter too much because it's just that little bit of sunshine there, bit of yellow on the back of her hand. You can see there, can't you, where the hat's running in. So we'll just move that across the back of her hand. And just got just a tiny bit of the chest showing here. If you look carefully, you'll actually see she's got a little necklace on there. You might want to pop that in as well. And just tidy that line up there. Again, the hat's running into that. Can you see the yellow's running into that a tiny touch? But it's nothing to worry about. This is part of the charm of watercolours, where they run into each other, and it's just getting used to them and getting to know where you're happy for it to do that and where you're not happy for it to do that. So we're going to move across to the hair, and she's got nice dark hair, so I'm going to use burnt sienna with a French ultramarine. And slightly more of the sienna than the ultramarine, so she's got a nice chestnutty colour hair. And when you're painting, paint in the direction that things are going. So, you know, imagine that this is her hair all flying out as you're painting, and as you move your hand along, lift your brush up slightly. And this is the first, you know, we're going to put more layers on. This is just the first layer. We didn't put any wax down here, but we need to leave some white of the paper in between some of this hair, just to show where the light's shining through her hair. I've got it quite straight actually. If you look back at the painting, her hair's a little bit curlier than I've done it. We could perhaps get some of those curls back with when I put the next layer on. And again, if that yellow runs into her hair there, that isn't a problem, because we're going to be going quite a bit darker yet under there when we put some more layers on, so it will all get covered up. So try and vary your lines here. Use that tip of your brush to get some nice fine lines. That's just down the back of a shirt there. Now you can see that shape come in. And at this stage I'm going to leave the whole thing to dry. Okay, so now that's dry, I'm going to go back up to those rocks and put more shadow where the sun's not getting down the bottom there. and some sort of imaginary lines up here as well, as if we know what's going on with this lighthouse. And then if we look carefully at the picture, there's a little bit of foliage on it, on the rocks as well. But I'm going to use quite a subdued green, because at that distance we don't want the green to jump forward in the picture. We want it still to be in the background and far away. So just again some of the yellow ochre and a tiny touch of the cobalt, plenty of water, and just dab 1 or 2 bits of imaginary foliage on the top there. So these are just dots and dashes. And then down at the base we need to go a little bit darker still, so I'm actually going to take some of that hair colour a little bit of extra ultramarine in, and whilst these bits down here are still wet, just tiny touch into the base there. And that's just where the sun can't get at all. Just tidy that line up with a damp brush. Okay, and then leave that completely, and that's done now, so we'll leave the background and move on back to the foreground. So I'm now going to put this band in, and that's, you would more or less call it black really, wouldn't you? So I'm going to use a thicker mix of that hair colour with more of the ultramarine and less water to put that band in. I mean, you could make this band any colour you wanted, it could be red, couldn't it, or anything. So you can see I've not put any extra paint on this brush. I've done that whole band, not taken my brush off the paper because it holds plenty of paint. Which is what you need in a good brush. Okay. And we'll leave that to dry and we'll go back to those hands. And we're going to get a slightly smaller brush and go back to that skin colour, but I'll put a bit of extra red in it. And look carefully at her hands where it's most red, so it's on the tips of her knuckles where they're bent. So 1, 2, 3, around her nails, so we can show that her nail's there by putting that tip in. It's got a shadow going on down that side of her finger, but again we're making this very simplified. Just picking out some of these shapes of the back of the hand. It's going to help give us that feel for the shape of her wrist and her hand. These shadows. Again, don't forget that's going to dry quite a bit lighter than it is. Same in here. Just pick out 1 or 2 of the shapes of the shadows and things you can see, just to emphasise that. I'm just going to get a damp brush now and soften the edges of some of those shapes, blending it in. And as you're doing so, imagine you're moving your brush around her hand. So don't just do that way. you know, our arms go around that way as well. And we're going to leave that. We don't want that hand too complicated, because that's when we start making a mess, when we start putting too much detail in there. Now the shirt is white, and I like to use a blue on a white as a shadow. So I'm going to go back again to the Cobolt, and I'm just going to make a new mix up of a nice fresh Cobolt and quite a lot of water. So hardly any colour. But most of it is in shadow. So to begin with, we'll put some of those lines of the fabric in, and don't obsess about where every single crease is in the fabric. You'd drive yourself mad when you come to doing fabrics, getting every crease in exactly the right place. Again, it's getting an impression of the fact that that shirt's billowing in the wind. Okay, and again we'll leave that to dry, and we're going to go back to the hair. Just the same colour. Getting more in there. And try and sharpen that line up of the hat as well. If you wanted to do yours differently to mine, you could. I've done an actual square. You could make it more oblong and have the hair flying out a bit further along your painting. Make more of a thing of this hair. And what we should have done, whilst we had that very dark colour on the palette, which I'll get back now, was put that line of the phone in the same colour as the hairband. Just again get that line straightened off. I've made a bit of a mess there. Now I'm going to go back to the hat and get some of those lines in of the wicker, and this is just going to help make the shape of the hat really. You could go mad and put all that detail in. If you look at it, there's loads of detail with those lines of the wicker, but I'm just going to put one or two lines on the top just so that we know which direction it's going in general. So this is quite a thick mix of the Cobolt yellow, but just and get your arm moving and get some nice sweeps round. If you wanted to, you could spend an awful lot of time doing every single line on this hat, but I'm not going to do that. I just want to get a nice impression of the shape that it's going in. Okay, and then back down to the shirt. These lines are now dry, so I'm going to put some more shadow on. So those lines are still going to go through, show through the shadow, but I'm going to put a wash more or less over all of it, because if you look at the picture, although we know her shirt's white, it's not really showing any white at all, it's all in shade. So can you see I'm just using the side of my brush to get some of that shadow on, but again, use your brush in the direction of the way that the fabric's going. When you're painting on top of colour that's already there, just imagine you're painting on glass. You don't want to lift any of that colour from underneath. I'm going to put a tiny bit of shadow, the shadow of her actually on the side of the boat there. And at this stage I'm going to leave it to dry. And now I'm going to put some shadow on the hat. And I'm going to use a violet for this, so I'm going to use a Winsor violet, the colour I like to use for shadows, especially when you've got yellows in your painting. It looks quite nice against it. Not too much pigment, plenty of water. And just look at where the shadows are going to be cast. So imagine the sun's coming from above. We're not making it as shadowy as it is on the actual picture, but we're going to have it so that it's picking up some of those shapes of the hat. And I don't know if you can see here, it's kind of folded over. So you're going to have a shadow there. And round probably underneath the band as well. And then to bring that colour down, look on the shirt where the absolute darkest areas are. So round her back here. Whoops. Again, it doesn't matter that we've gone over the line down here, because that's all going to be outside of the picture. And pick up some of those shapes again of the fabric, because it's casting its own shadows. And then back to the hair again, and getting that really nice dark colour. One or two extra flicks. Of course, it's going to be really dark underneath the rim of the hat there. I'm just hoping at the end of this video that you're not seeing my head all the time in the shot, because I'm actually standing up to work today. I'm usually sitting down, but so getting a bit of variety in her hair there, some dark and some lighter where the sun's shining on it. Get that nice and dark. Seems to have made a mess with that shadow there somehow. Let's get that right. Right off. I'm going to just add another couple of lines to that band just to break it up a bit, make it a bit more interesting. Just again with the dark. And then the last but not least thing that I'm going to do, any picture always looks a lot more vibrant and exciting with a little touch of red. So I'm going to go for that Cadmium Orange that we used in the skin, just so that we're repeating the same colours, and she's going to have a little bit of a bikini showing here. and that's just going to finish it off. So I hope you enjoy having a go at that. Like I say, the picture is below in the description, the link to it. If you look at my hat compared to the picture, it's a little bit on the squish side. In fact, let's try and just sort that out a bit. I think what I could do there is take that line just seem to not have much of a distinction between this part of the hat and this part, but there isn't actually too much on the actual painting itself. I think I've not got this band coming low enough. It should be perhaps a little bit lower. So that's my drawing not being right to begin with. So you can make a better job of your drawing than I have. But yeah, like I said, the link's down there. Enjoy that. Hope you get on okay with it and let me know what you think. Thanks for watching and bye for now.